Military HF Radio, Episode 5, HF Antennas. I'm your host, Matthew Sherburne, KF4WZB. We're just about halfway through the whole video series with HF antennas. Next we'll be going over 2G and 3G ALE, followed by digital communications, a little bit of a background into U.S. Army Mars, and then finally lessons from the field. So for today's agenda, we're going to be talking about two different types of HF antennas, those used at the halt and those that are used on the move, meaning typical antennas you may find on vehicles. So for at the halt, we'll go over horizontal dipole, the inverted V dipole, off-center fed dipole, terminated folded dipole, and then the AS2259 military HF Nivis antenna. What I will not be discussing are a whole other variety of antennas, such as Yagi-Uda antennas or the random length wire antennas that you may also find. More specifically, because I want to discuss antennas that you actually can use for HF Nivis. So let's start off with your basic horizontal dipole antenna. The antenna itself is a length of wire, or actually two wires that together is a half wavelength of the intended frequency you're using. So to go back on wavelength, which we typically refer to in meters, such as 80 meters, 40 meters, is actually describing a frequency, but with respect to its wavelength. And we have a calculation you can use in order to find the length in feet. So you take 468 divided by the frequency you intend to use, or that is center to a group of frequencies you intend to use, in megahertz. So let's say that you want to use frequencies around 5 megahertz. You would take 468 divided by 5, and you get roughly 90 feet. It's almost more like 94. And then you would take half of that to come up with the quarter wavelength of wire that you would have on each side of this device called a balun. So what is a balun? Why do you see that up there? Well, balun means balanced to unbalanced. And the reason why we have this is because most radios on the back of them have this connector that is meant to hook to a coax line. Well, the coax line is formed with a center signal wire surrounded by this shield, this metal braid. Well, the braid itself doesn't have the signal on it, but the center wire does. The whole point of the braid is to actually shield the center signal wire from electromagnetic interference. Having said that, though, both wires, if you want to treat them as individual wires, do not have equal amounts of that signal on them. And so we use this balun to then convert that center signal wire and the outer ground braid to then have a signal go across both wires, to the left of that quarter wavelength of wire and to the right side as well. At the very ends of these wires, you need to use an insulator, a dielectric. So that can be plastic, that can be glass. They make them, can buy them online, or if you're in a pinch, you're out in the field environment, you can put a hole through a plastic spoon that comes with your MRE, and you can utilize the properties, the dielectric properties of a plastic spoon to act as your insulator. The reason being is once everything gets wet in the rain, you want something that can ensure that the signal stops at the end of the wire and doesn't keep going. And then you can use whatever type of rope you need to secure it to tree. So, having said that, that means you have to have objects out there in the field that can support this wire antenna. You can either use two OE254 support pole systems, or you can try to find nearby trees. Ensure, though, that when you're using these dipole antennas that you're not deep in the thick of a forest. You can to some extent, but you want to try to find somewhat of an opening or clearing, because the trees will tend to absorb some of the signal, and it's best to try to get an open area as best as you can. Though I've operated one of these in the middle of a forest and get somewhat good performance. Bottom left hand of this screen is the GRA 50 Balun. This is a typical military Balun that you'll find out there. You can see in the center of it is where you would connect in the coax line. They're typically N-type connectors. This is something that we don't typically use in the HF frequencies in amateur radio. We typically use SO 259s and or also known as UHF connectors, but not N-type. That's more of a professional grade connector. It helps seal out moisture better. So when you go online looking for coax line with pre-soldered connectors in the amateur radio world, you're going to notice that that will not connect with some of the military gear we have. So you just have to be mindful of that. You have to ensure you know what you're ordering with pre-soldered ends that will match what you're using. We also use BNC heavily in the military world as well. So you just have to be mindful of that. Bottom right-hand corner of this chart is the radiation pattern. And it's interesting to note that as you're looking in from the side of the antenna, the ends of it, if you will, looking down the wire, if you will, is the radiation pattern in which a lot more of the energy at lower frequencies is directed up. And this is fantastic for near vertical incident skywave because we're typically using 2 to 12 megahertz, and you want your antenna to radiate with a high takeoff angle as possible. What you see at 10 megahertz and higher is that the antenna will then radiate more signal at lower angles. Think about that. So one of the reasons why NIVIS is found at lower frequencies is due to this as well. But with this antenna, you can utilize NIVIS and you'll be good to go. With your radio, you see the orange box there, the dark gold PRC 150 radio. You want to make sure that that radio is grounded. There is a grounding terminal on it. You want to ensure that you stake that into the ground. It works as a counterpoise and helps boost performance of your radio. So always ground it, no matter where it's located. How can we improve the antenna's ability to gain a higher takeoff angle? How can we improve NIVIS performance? Well, this works. Let me show you here for a second. You're going to have your normal horizontal dipole antenna that's half a wavelength long. So again, if it's 5 megahertz, about around 90 feet long. Okay, you'll have your insulators here, your dielectrics, and then rope tied to either a tree or a pole out in the field. About 0.15-ish wavelengths below the main dipole antenna, you just have a straight piece of wire. Again, using insulators to ensure that it is isolated from whatever support structure you're tying it to. The length of it will be about 5% longer than the dipole's length. This is going to act as a reflector. For some of you that are ham savvy and antenna savvy will note that this is what is basically the foundations of a Yagi-Uda antenna. You have a reflector, a non-driven element that is slightly longer than the driven element, meaning this is where your coax cable is connected to. And this helps to direct the energy, in this case, vertical. And this will help us achieve a higher takeoff angle. It will direct more of that energy as high as possible instead of having some of that energy radiating towards the sides. And this does work. I've had one unit that did see an increase in performance using this. So this is one method you can use to help boost your performance. Notice though that again this is at the halt. So something that you might use at a tactical operations center, but not something you're necessarily going to set up that quickly when you're on the move, because you can't, you're on the move. Next, we're going to talk about the inverted V. This has different characteristics. I typically use inverted V antennas not so much for NIVIS, but more for gaining directionality, higher frequencies, longer distance contacts. But just like with the dipole, horizontal dipole antenna, with this inverted V, you can place a reflector below the driven element, the main dipole antenna that you have your coax connected to, and you can then again achieve a higher takeoff angle, directing more of your energy vertically to achieve better performance on NIVIS. You can use this as well. Why would somebody use an inverted V rather than the horizontal dipole? Well, let me take you back to the previous slide here if I can, and you're going to notice you need two support structures. What if you can't find, or you don't have two support structures? Well then, if you only have one single support structure, you just tie the balun to that, say this a mast or just a tree, and then you can use stakes to secure the ropes connected to the insulator, the ends of the antenna. So it really means that you can still achieve the mission, just given restrictions in the environment. Off-center fed dipoles. I'm going to talk about this one because I see people trying to present this to soldiers as another option of an antenna you can get. And there's amateur radio companies that sell these, but they're actually meant to be used with amateur radio frequencies. So what it is by offsetting where the balun is located with respect to the rest of the antenna, then you can achieve better standing wave ratio performance at key frequencies. And you're going to see here it says it will have natural dips in the SWR throughout a frequency range due to have reasonable low impedances at even harmonics. Let me break that one down for you. So you typically want an antenna with a 2-to-1 SWR or better, 1-to-1 being the ideal. It's hard to achieve that perfectly. There's always imperfections in the system, but that's what you want. What that means is that for every watt that you're transmitting from the radio, it's actually going out of the antenna. When you have a mismatch, an SWR mismatch, some of that energy is reflected. I'm not going to get into the weeds on that in this lesson, but what it just means is that you need to have a well-tuned antenna, and for anything that you're operating on that is not tuned very well, the PRC 150 and other higher-end amateur radios include a tuner, a built-in tuner that will tune it. Okay, PRC 150 will tune garbage. However, let's say you have a 7-to-1 mismatch going on your antenna. PRC 150 may tune it, but then your antenna and your performance will not be as efficient as if the antenna already was tuned maybe down to at least a 2-to-1 or better. And then the PRC 150 would ensure to try to get it to a 1-to-1 or 1.1-to-1 match as possible. The off-center fed dipole solves the issue of being able to use a range of frequencies across the HF band, 3 to 30 megahertz, by having those natural dips, those 2-to-1 or better SWR performances at those critical frequencies that we use. Problem is, the military doesn't use amateur radio frequencies, and so if you're trying to inform soldiers about, hey, there's an off-center fed dipole you can go out and get, well, the SWR dips are actually at, let's say, 3.5, 7, 14, 18, 24.8 and 28 megahertz. Those are popular amateur radio bands. The problem is the actual military frequencies that you're using, if you use this antenna with them, the SWR is actually 7-to-1. And so now the PRC 150 is trying to tune that, and it may in the end successfully tune it, but now your overall system performance the max amount of power that you're actually able to put through that antenna now is reduced, because now you're trying to tie that all up in the tuning circuitry, and it just doesn't work as well. So the reason why I'm going in depth and ad nauseum about this is that this is not necessarily the best solution for a military problem. Definitely a great antenna for amateur radio, though. The terminated folded dipole. Now this is a fantastic antenna if you have the space for it. It is 90 feet long. They typically always sell these in about that length. That happens to be half wavelength of 5 megahertz, which is about the middle range of the NIVIS slate of frequencies. It almost kind of looks like two dipole antennas stacked on each other. And it almost is, but it's actually one contiguous wire that runs out, around, and then back over in a big loop, and then back over again. Each of these white vertical lines actually is, and what they use for these is nothing more than PVC pipe with a hole cut through them to put the wire through, and they're just spacers. At the very end, a rope goes through the very last section of PVC pipe on each end. And then you tie that off to an insulator and then to another rope that then goes to your anchor points. United States Military Academy utilizes one of these. Fantastic antenna. And we have used this to talk all the way into Europe and subsequently all the way over to Vancouver. So you can get really good performance from just a basic dipole antenna. No Yagis needed, as you need. The fantastic thing about this antenna is that it's what's known as broadbanded. That means that pretty much, okay, I can't stake my career on this one, but pretty much gets a 2-to-1 SWR or better across all frequencies 2 to 30 megahertz. That's not necessarily true. I've had some touchy points with some certain frequencies that did require the use of an antenna tuner. But the good news is that all these military radios have built-in antenna tuners. Again, make sure that your radio is grounded, whether it's inside a building that needs to be grounded to a ground point, or if it's outside, stake that into the ground to its grounding terminal. These can run you, depending on what version you get, either like a 100-watt version, or if you get the high-powered version, depending if you're hooking this up to a power amplifier, it might be doing more than 800 watts. You're looking at anywhere between $300 and about $700. Considering how much military antennas are sold, that's still a pretty good price. And you can go online and find these. Okay, now I'm going to talk about this antenna. This is the AS2259. It is marketed as the NIVIS antenna. And makes people think that this is the only thing you can use to do NIVIS with. And so that's why I want to talk a little bit about this. I'll tell you up front, don't use it. I'll tell you right now, there is no need to use it because a standard horizontal dipole antenna, or inverted V, will do just fine for the job. Okay? And not only that, this particular antenna has a lot of parts that go missing all the time. I'll even have another slide on that too. Not only will you see it called the AS2259, it's also called the Collins 637K1, the Telex 1990, or the Harris RF 1936, all sold for at least $2,000 to $3,000 because. Now what is it? What is it made of? Well, there's a base plate in which you connect your coax line to, and then these support poles. Well, they're actually dual function. Not only are they support poles for the center of which all the wires connect to, but it also is essentially hard line coax. You hook your flexible line coax into the base, and then each of these tubes are actually hard line coax. You'll notice a center piece of metal on each end, and it actually goes all the way through, surrounded by some type of insulation, usually some kind of hard foam insulation, and then the outside is this sturdy, rigid aluminum or steel that acts as the outer grounding and shielding. why do you see 4 wires? It actually is 2 inverted V dipoles that are just offset 90 degrees from each other. And so one dipole works from 2 to 7.5 megahertz, and then the other dipole works from 7.5 to 12 megahertz, taking care of the entire spread of the typical NIVIS frequencies we use. But a standard dipole, as it's radiating that high takeoff energy, as it refracts off the ionosphere, the polarization is random. And so they try to market this particular antenna because it's got 2 dipoles offset 90 degrees from each other, that it's omnidirectional. Well, a dipole antenna, as its high takeoff angle occurs and refracts off the ionosphere almost nearly directly above the antenna, it is going off in various different polarizations. And so it really doesn't matter what you're starting off with. Does the antenna then, this particular one, AS2259, have better receive performance because it's got antennas offset from each other 90 degrees, so it can handle different polarizations and therefore have a better degree of receiving more signal? Potentially. But again, you're bringing out a lot more parts that can go missing and complicate matters. What am I talking about? This. I think everybody watching this can relate to me on this, because you'll pull out these bags, typically out of Connexes, open them up, getting ready for the field. Sometimes if you even bother to check them and inspect them before you go out to the field, or let's say you keep it exciting and you don't, you go out to the field, you're like, I got these poles, what do I connect? How do I connect it? Well, you're probably missing this part off to the right. This is the most critical part too. This is the base plate where you connect the BNC connector here. There's actually a protective cap on it right now, but this is the BNC connector that you would connect your radio to. And then the hardline coax start right here. And then this is where you put all the subsequent sections on top of each other. Without this, you're not doing anything. So, you can order this part, make sure your kit's complete, but there's a lot of moving parts to this. As opposed to your balun and 2 pieces of wire to put together your horizontal dipole, or this antenna. So, what I'm here to tell you is you do not need the AS2259 to do NIVIS. You can just use a dipole antenna. Or you can make your own. W9WIS is an amateur radio operator that said, hey, we can just make our own. And it's pretty ingenious, but you go to this website and has everything that I'm showing here, where you can just use PVC pipe and use that as your support structure, and then just run coax line all the way through to the top, and then terminate that into a SO239 socket connector for the coax, and then on top you connect 1/2 of your length of wire to the ground section, and then the other half goes to the signal, and then that would be your 2 to 7.5 megahertz run, and then subsequently you would 90 degrees offset from those have another dipole antenna, if you will, 1/2 connected to ground, the other half connected to the signal. Notice that this is not a balun here then being used, and that would be your 7.5 to 12 megahertz run. And you can see the distances here, 25 feet and 25 feet and 38 feet and 38 feet going 90 degrees from each other. So pretty neat. So ham radio operators are pretty resourceful. They've figured out how to do this stuff on their own. And I can tell you right now that the difference between this and that is probably $1,000. You could probably make all of this for at least under $80. Okay, now let's talk about HF radio antennas on the move. Well, this has been done for decades. And during the interwar years, a period of flourishing innovation amongst major nations between World War I and World War II, the Germans knew that if they were going to tackle true blitzkrieg, which worked so well in World War I that it actually failed because they outran their ability to communicate between themselves to coordinate further pushing through deep into enemy territory, they needed to work on communications. And so what they developed was having radios in every vehicle, or at least every key vehicle, something General Heinz Guderian spearheaded. But with it, radios, you need antennas. And so the antennas they developed, sometimes known as bed rail or cage antennas, and that's why you have what looks like a cage on top of this type of vehicle. There's also the other half-track vehicle you'll see General Heinz Guderian in the back there with this rail over his head. It wasn't meant to protect him from rollover. It's actually part of the antenna. And these types of antennas designed for NIVIS, though they didn't really know what NIVIS was. They just knew that at certain frequencies, and at that time, radios really only worked between, you can see here, 0.27 megahertz, which happens to be what NIVIS mainly worked on. That's how they were able to communicate. They could communicate between units that were on opposite ends of a mountain. They could operate out to 400 to 500 miles in some cases. Fantastic. So this is World War II. Then after World War II, everybody started to try to move towards other means of communication and SATCOM. And then there was sort of this resurgence towards the late 70s and 80s on HF again. And something noted in some of Lieutenant Colonel retired Dave Feidler's papers in the mid-80s, early 80s even, is that they see these BTRs, these Soviet vehicles designed to move troops into combat, having what looked like a NIVIS cage rail and type of antenna. And so it looked like they were getting back into it. Do we need to have such an advanced antenna on our vehicles? Well, Colonel Feidler said all you got to do is take a HF vertical antenna and just bend it over. And by bending it over, you actually have your radiation takeoff angle go vertical instead of horizontal. And so you can achieve NIVIS just by bending over these HF whip antennas. And that's critical because units will go out in the field, they'll leave their vertical whip antennas vertical, thinking that that should work. It just means that when you're on HF, that just means you go longer distances. Well, the problem is that when you have the vertical antenna vertical, it has a takeoff angle between 20 and 30 degrees. If your units are spread out far enough, you're actually going to skip right over them. However, if everybody, and so this means everybody in the formation has to have their vertical whip antenna bent over, either over the vehicle or behind it. I'll show you in the next slide the different radiation patterns that happen when you do either. Now, everybody's signal is going as high up as it can at a high enough angle, and you're kind of shooting for 70 to 90 degrees, and then it refracts back off the ionosphere and then comes back down almost pretty much on top of you out to 400 miles. And now everybody can communicate with each other within a 400-mile radius instead of skipping over them. And so everybody says, HF doesn't work, HF doesn't work. I bet you could have actually been talking to somebody 1,000 miles away if they were just on the same frequency. They could have been talking to you. It's because you're skipping over everybody. And so that's why you need to use vocap analysis to understand what frequency, time of day, and is it going to work. So from Lieutenant Colonel retired Dave Feidler's paper, he went through, hand-sketched, I applaud him, it's an old school way of doing things, the radiation pattern for if you take a vertical whip antenna and leave it vertical. If you leave it vertical, you can see where, because of the high metal content of the vehicle, you are getting a lot more signal going forward than back. So that's something interesting to note. It's particularly if that antenna is all the way on the back of the vehicle, just how it has to be. It's the best place to put it. And you get signal going anywhere between maybe 20 degrees, maybe even as high as 45 degrees, but not the above 45 degrees to 90 degrees that we really need to in place NIVIS. So the signal's going out here, and it's going to go and basically skip over your entire formation. Let's say we bend it back about 45 degrees. Well, now you get more of your energy, maybe 45 to 50 degrees. Now let's tilt it all the way to the back. And now most of your signal, because your vehicle is actually a counterpoise, so this is like one half of the antenna, here's the other half. Most of your signal is now almost going near vertical. That's fantastic, and that's what we need for NIVIS. What if we bend it over the front of the vehicle? That makes more sense, right? I mean, if you have this 15 feet of antenna all the way out behind you, somebody else could run into you, especially if you're in a convoy. Well, let's move it over the front of the vehicle. Well, this is what you get, and it's not ideal, but it will still work. You're getting some signal, not quite at 0 dBm, but maybe seeing more signal out to 60 degrees in the front, a little bit in the back. Not as high takeoff angle as possible, but it's better than most of your signal going around 30 degrees if the antenna was straight vertical. So the ideal placement of a HF vertical whip antenna for NIVIS is to have it leaning straight back behind the vehicle, if possible, if you can drive around like that, or if just need be, take the antenna and bend it to the forward part of the vehicle, get a piece of rope and tie it to the front of the vehicle. So on that note, we see this. On the left-hand side, we have a Humvee and we have an MRAP. You have the 15-foot HF whip antenna pulled forward on both of these vehicles. These other vertical antennas left vertical, that's for VHF communications, and they should be left like that. But you can see here both of their HF antennas are pulled over. Sad to say that maybe they did this just out of functionality, that they didn't want 15 feet of antenna straight up, and they probably weren't even using HF, but let's just assume they were, and they were doing what they needed to make NIVIS work. This is what you need to do. Now, people have already researched how to do something better than just taking a HF antenna and bending it forward. To do NIVIS, there's actually the RF3134 on the move vehicular loop antenna. This is a mag loop antenna that you see on the right hand side on the back of this Humvee. Takes up some real estate in the back slightly, and this does a very good job of achieving high takeoff angle radiation. This box you see here in the back is actually a auto tune coupler. It can handle a lot of power. And then inside the vehicle would be the antenna and probably even the amplifier, depending on what this is using. So, two different ways to tackle this. Most people already have a vertical whip antenna. This is all they have to do is bend it over. Or you can go out and try to requisition this type of antenna for your vehicle if you haven't already. What about your car? Let's say you just want to do this because you're an amateur radio operator on the side of being a military communications professional, and you want something for your own car because you're not going to be able to use one of those other antennas. Well, Tom over here on the right-hand side, WB3AKD, did this. Appears to have ran wire through maybe what looks like a PVC support structure. Okay, if you don't want to look too crazy, then you can just get your standard vertical whip antenna. This has a built-in auto tuning element in the base of it. You can bend that over when you need to do NIVIS, or kind of like the Russians did, or the Germans, you have this kind of cage antenna on the top of your vehicle. Again, I'm not a spokesperson for Stealth, I'm just bringing up their product. But here is a cage to put extra equipment, or if you take all that equipment off, it will auto raise this rail that's actually the antenna element to achieve high angle takeoff radiation. The New Jersey National Guard, under the leadership of Lieutenant Colonel Dave Filer for their communications system for HF, took a NIVIS tail boom antenna off of a Huey helicopter and put it on top of their communications van, and that's what you're seeing right here. On that note, a lot of our aviation has removed these antennas to save weight, but if they had them on there, then helicopters could communicate HF, fly nap of the earth, and be able to utilize NIVIS in order to get up and over obstacles to talk to other units. So they just used this in the, I think about late 80s, they put this together. Just ingenious. Okay, well, thank you very much for watching. I wanted to do a lot of explanation to try to help inform folks on what's the bare minimum in order to do NIVIS. Also, just the type of antennas that could be out there. I know I didn't get into the weeds of all those other cool field expedient antennas and whatnot that you could use, like random length wire antennas. Just know that they're there. But I wanted to go on to the other antennas that you will encounter to do NIVIS and really succeed at communicating near you all the way out to about 400 miles, whether you're at the halt or on the move. This is what you need. And so I want to make sure that I inform you all on what it is and what it's going to take. It's not just the radio and having the antenna. It's to have the antenna in the correct orientation. It's to have the radio on the right frequencies at the right time of day. And I hope that this is all coming together as you're watching all of these episodes. Put all this information together and synthesize it and understand how to get out there and employ this. The next lesson is going to be building on everything else, now talking about automatic link establishment and what 2G and 3G are. And it will be great to talk about. Again, 2G and 3G is not to be taken in context of cellular technology. That's not the same thing. It is second generation and third generation, but in the context of HF, automatic link establishment. So we'll talk more about that. If you like what you're watching, please hit subscribe, like the video, and we will be pushing out more of these videos here shortly. Thank you so much for watching.